All right.
Right. Welcome, everyone, to COP26 Report Back with Makerusa Porotesano. Let me let you introduce yourself.
Oh yeah. Makerusa Porotesano, he him his pronouns. I work for the Sylvania Multicultural Center, but we're here representing the Multicultural Center district team as a whole.
Yeah. Thanks, everybody, for joining. If you have questions throughout the presentation, feel free to put them in the chat and we will try to answer them as timely as possible. Um, and if we have some time, maybe we will have a Q&A towards the end. My name is Monica. I am the program assistant for the Sylvania Multicultural Center. I use she, her, and hers pronouns, and I will be helping facilitate this conversation today. All right. Mac, do you want to take it away, or do you want to
Yeah,
let people like come in? I don't.
I think we can give it a minute, and maybe I'll just do some more introductions of myself. I will be able to talk about the work that I do at PCC and also with the Pacific Climate Warriors and stuff here in Oregon. So I don't want to give away too much that the presentation will handle, but we're very thankful for folks who are tuning in, and for those who aren't able to attend the live stream, you'll be able to check out the saved recordings on any one of our platforms. And I think those three are Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter.
Yeah, most definitely. Are you happy to be back, though?
I'm happy to be back. I miss my friends. I miss my family, in Coppin, especially with the PCW folks. Definitely when you spend 3 weeks together for like 20 hours a day, you need some space. And then when you get that space, you realize how much you miss everybody. But I don't miss that hotel room. And I don't miss the small shower, but it's good to be home and it's good to be back with our PCC colleagues. It's funny, like when you're there, I miss everyone here, and now that I'm here, I miss everybody there. It's like I need to be
Oh.
satisfied where I'm at.
We need some like futuristic Star Trek transporters.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
All right, I think I can go ahead and get started.
All right.
All right. Yeah, so I'll have a slide presentation, and again, folks, just feel free to, if you write in any one of the comments on any one of the platforms, we'll be able to see it and um, be able to answer any questions or highlight some of the comments that are being made. So thank you, everybody. And I see you, Andrew. Glad you can be here. So my name is Makerusa Porotesano. Again, I use he, him, his pronouns. Sylvania Multicultural Center Coordinator. And I sit on the Council of Elders with the Pacific Climate Warrior Global Team. And I'm here to just talk about my experience at the UN Climate Change Conference and report back on, some of the happenings at COP, things that happen within our team, uh, some of the access I had while we were there, and some of the news that we want to bring back to folks. Topics to cover. So we'll talk about what is COP. That's always like the big thing. Like, what is COP? I don't know what you're talking about. I come home and I tell my mom what the COP, and she's just like, "Did you get arrested? Like, what do you mean COP? What are you bringing up the cops for?" No, we're gonna talk about what COP is. How did we get to COP26? We'll touch on that on a few different points here and there in the presentation. I also dig into like my role in climate justice. I don't think it's something we talk a lot about in the in terms of like multicultural center work, and why that's important to PCC, and how I bring that into space. I didn't just get to go to COP out of nowhere. And then we'll talk about like what ocean's role is in climate justice. What is ocean? What does that mean to us as Pacific Islanders? And sort of the role the Pacific played and its leadership in COP26 and all the other COPs previous coming into this work. We'll talk about some of the outcomes, personal experiences, and then tap into some fun stuff. And we can get through all that. I'm hoping to do that within the hour, and we can save the rest of the time for a Q&A. So for today's conversations, here are just a few community agreements. We've already went over the messaging, and we'll be able to see all your messages that you provide to us, and it doesn't matter what platform. StreamYard will allow us to see it. The other thing too is COP is huge, right? And it's like nearly impossible, at least for me, to understand all the workings of COP. And so if folks have questions about something you read on the news, or you want to know some very specifics about like the science or the negotiations, those are just many different ways that people enter COP, that not necessarily where I entered the work. So I'll try to answer what I can, and if we can't answer any of your questions, we'll try to find the resources to get you those answers. And then there's many ways to participate in COP, right? I'm just reflecting back on my experience and how I participated. So what is COP, right? Here's like a basic breakdown. COP stands for the Conference of Parties. Parties meaning countries, those who are going to participate. And they choose to participate and address the effects of climate change. This is the 26th gathering of the parties. And instead of me talking about it, I have someone who can talk about it a lot better than I can. This is Joseph Sikulu. He is the managing director, everything for Pacific Climate Warrior Team and 350 Pacific. Check it out.
People to the front.
COP stands for Conference of the Parties. It's the decision-making body of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the UNFCCC, which meets every year to discuss how to take on the climate crisis in a coordinated, multilateral way. The COP started in 1994 and are almost universal, with 197 states who are parties to the convention. One country gets one vote. This year, COP26 will be held in Glasgow, Scotland, under the UK's presidency in partnership with Italy. This meeting is a big deal, as the state representatives will review their goals to reduce emissions, the so-called nationally determined contributions, or NDCs, and develop a long-term plan to raise funds that will finance climate solutions in the most vulnerable nations in order to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement.
People to the front.
So I'll give a really short breakdown of like how we got to COP. I think there's like two markers for me that I understand more than others. So before the Glasgow Accords were produced, there was something called the Paris Climate Accords, and before the Paris Climate Accords, or COP21, we were running under the Kyoto Protocol. And to kind of just break it down, there will be another video later of someone who explains it way better than me. But I'll just give a brief overview of like my understanding of this. So the Kyoto Protocols is really just a few years after COP started, and it was the ability to identify where folks were at in terms of their carbon emissions, and really like a collection of landing as a collective community. So you can see 192 parties signed on to the Kyoto Protocols. But once we're able to identify countries in terms of like their carbon emissions, something really big happens at the Paris Climate Accords, or COP21, in 2014. And that's when we start to set new standards and collective understandings of how countries are going to hold each other accountable for enacting the plans that came from the Accords. And so like the big one that came out for us out of the Pacific was something from the High Ambition Coalition. We'll talk about that name, the hack, later, because for some reason on live TV I decided to name it something else. Pushing the standards to make sure that everybody can survive through these accords. And so the big language that came out of there for us was maintaining the global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The original language was 2 degrees, and literally on the last day, language and support for 1.5 was included. One of the pictures you might see a lot of and later on in the presentation is the 1.5 with the hands, just a reminder of our goals that we're trying to set. And so 5 years after the Paris Climate Accords, or 5 COPs later, we're here at the Glasgow Accords, and a lot of this stuff was to set more ambitious and marks to meet the 1.5 threshold. And we'll kind of get into that and what that means later on, because there was a lot that went on. A lot of people aren't happy with what happened in the Glasgow Accords, and I think the whole story is not being told. So we'll dig into that later. But yeah, how did I get started in all this stuff? And why pick someone randomly? It wasn't randomly, but out of the U.S. to participate in this with the global team of Pacific Climate Warriors. So a lot of my earlier starts, and I guess I should frame this one way, like I was born here in Portland, Oregon. I did have my travels back to my home country of American Samoa, a U.S. territory in the South Pacific. And but living in Portland, there wasn't a lot of representation, and I could either sit around and be like, I'm never going to see myself in this space, or I can go out and start organizing and make things happen, especially in the education realm. So these pictures are of gatherings of the Pacific Islander Student Alliance Conference, something I started when I was an undergrad student. And for a lot of Pacific Islanders, being able to meet in large groups like this, especially at the college level, isn't something that's afforded to a lot of us. So these are pretty sacred spaces for a lot of our community to be able to gather. But working in those spaces, brought some notoriety, and I think organizing also with nonprofit groups with Asian and Pacific Islander communities also helped me get into spaces. But I'll kind of find a way to frame this, because I'm going to show you a lot of the big things I've kind of done and been a part of, and also kind of like reframe this work in terms of like how I really got started and where folks can get started too, especially our students. So one of the big things and the tipping points for me, like I really got to kick in and do this work, was when my daughter was born. And her mother in 2014 at the UN General Assembly delivered this speech and poem, and really committed our family to take part in this climate work. And so this is Dear Matafela Bainum by Kathy Jetno Kijiner. Check it out.
Our next speaker was selected from more than 500 candidates to represent the voice of civil society. From the Marshall Islands, please welcome Kathy Jetno Kijiner.
Yahweh Molib, I would like to share with you a poem that I have written for my daughter, Matafela Bainum. Dear Matafela Bainum, you are a 7-month-old sunrise of gummy smiles. You are bald as an egg and bald as the Buddha. Your thighs that are thunder, shrieks that are lightning, so excited for bananas, hugs, and our morning walks along the lagoon. Dear Matafela Bainum, I want to tell you about that lagoon, that lucid, sleepy lagoon lounging against the sunrise. Men say that one day, that lagoon will devour you. They say it will gnaw at the shoreline, chew at the roots of your breadfruit trees, gulp down rows of your seawalls, and crunch through your island's shattered bones. They say you, your daughter, and your granddaughter too, will wander rootless, with only a passport to call home. Dear Matafela Bainum, don't cry. Mommy promises you, no one will come and devour you. No greedy whale of a company sharking through political seas, no backwater bullying of businesses with broken morals, no blindfolded bureaucracies gonna push this mother ocean over the edge. No one's drowning, baby. No one's moving. No one's losing their homeland. No one's gonna become a climate change refugee. Or should I say, no one else. To the Carteret Islanders of Papua New Guinea and to the Taro Islanders of Fiji, I take this moment to apologize to you. We are drawing the line here because, baby, we are going to fight. Your mommy, daddy, boo-boo, Dimma, your country, and your president too, we will all fight. And even though there are those hidden behind platinum titles who like to pretend that we don't exist, that the Marshall Islands, Tuvalu, Kiribati, Maldives, and Typhoon Haiyan in the Philippines, and floods of Pakistan, Algeria, and Colombia, and hurricanes, tidal waves, and earthquakes didn't exist, still, there are those who see us, hands reaching out, fists raising up, banners unfurling, megaphones booming, and we are canoes blocking coal ships. We are the radiance of solar villages. We are the rich, clean soil of the farmer's past. We are petitions blooming from teenage fingertips. We are families, biking, recycling, reusing, engineers, dreaming, designing, building, artists, painting, dancing, writing. We are spreading the word. And there are thousands out on the street, marching with signs, hand in hand, chanting for change now. They're marching for you, baby. They're marching for us. Because we deserve to do more than just survive. We deserve to thrive. Dear Mata Filipino, you are eyes heavy with drowsy weight. So just close those eyes, baby, and sleep in peace. Because we won't let you down. You'll see.
All right. Yeah, one of the cool things we learned about that the presentation was that when we were done with the presentation, we got home to our hotel. The Assistant Secretary General of the UN came over to tell us that, to tell Kathy that the standing ovation that she got was only the second time at the UN that they had one, and the first one was Nelson Mandela. So that was that's how huge and monumental that speech was and meant to a lot of folks. And to be a part of that, I didn't do anything but hold a baby, so I gotta take a lot of credit for being there. But it was an experience because I think it doubled down on what the Pacific has been doing in terms of our oral traditions being able to have an impact, to have storytelling, to have an impact. And I think that's really impactful and powerful. Well, actually, a year later, I moved to the Marshall Islands after that, and I worked for the University of the South Pacific. And I was the manager for continuing education and climate change, and there to start campus life on that campus. But one of the cool things I got to do is when we were working in our climate change office was to do a lot of the work that was needed at the time. And in 2015 and 16, the Marshall Islands was going through the biggest drought it's ever seen. And for a lot of our climate work, we're talking about natural disasters like drought, like tropical storms. What we're talking about every year is the strongest one, is always the strongest one every year. And one of the things we had to do is go out and teach some drought resistance work, water preservation campaigns. And so you can see here, we were getting folks to invest in more local farming because they needed to grow their own crops, right? And in order to do that too, they needed to preserve water. So you can see these water catchment devices that we made. Basically, it's a tin roof that catches water and it drops into these water catchments. And why that's so important is because on a lot of the atoll islands, low atoll islands, there aren't mountains, there aren't rivers, there aren't lakes. And so there aren't really a lot of ways to gather water in the amount of quantity that's needed for these outer islands. And so we're really on the ground working with community and doing some amazing work there in the Marshall Islands. And some years later, then I'm finally asked to join the Pacific Climate Warriors. I think because of time, I won't show all the videos, but one of the things we wanted to do is introduce that work here to the Pacific Northwest and to the US. And so one of the first things I was able to do is work with the Have Your Say campaign for COP26, which was the first year. Well, I don't know, it was the first year, but the Fiji held the presidency that year. And it was held in Bonn, Germany. So here's a video of some college campuses around the way that deliver the message of telling folks to have their say at COP23.
Aloha from Chaminade University in beautiful Hawaii.
Talofa from Ocean Beach.
in the beautiful city of San Francisco, California.
What's up from Portland State and beautiful Portland, Oregon.
As our Pacific Climate Warriors get ready for the COP23,
we lend our support and our solidarity
in the fight to save the Pacific
and people around the world.
Climate change poses a direct threat.
We are not drowning, we are fighting.
We will have our say.
As friends, family, and allies
of Oceania,
we are asking Pacific Islanders
and people around the world
to join the Have Your Say campaign.
Join the call to end the era of fossil fuels. Move to 100% renewable energy.
Kick big polluters out of climate talks.
Support the adaptation of vulnerable communities.
And do what is needed to limit warming to 1.5 Celsius.
Sign a Pacific Climate Warriors Declaration on climate change by visiting www.haveyoursay.org.
And share your story online using hashtag #HaveYourSay.
And continue the work
to ensure that our islands stay above water.
Faftai Tirilawa, and thank you very much.
In the next video I'm gonna play actually features let me frame it this way. When I got to PCC, one of the things I wanted to make sure in our Multicultural Center was that we were participating in climate activism. And so we created what we called Eco Justice Champions who work at our center. And that position is still around this year. Trina Sound is our Eco Justice Advocate. And the year before that, we had Kevin Ipopo, who worked in our office and now works in climate justice work as a organizer with Opal. But in 2019, one of the last actions we were able to do, we participated in a climate strike, which I think saw over 25,000 people march the streets of Portland. And Kevin was able to address the community with a poem he wrote. And it did so well that it was featured on 350.org. Some colleagues of ours meshed it up with a video they were able to collect from Tuvalu and, laced it up with Kevin's speech. So check it out and enjoy. Oop, I need to hit present.
I held my newborn cousin for the first time. I am 22 years old and I've never been to my homeland. When he is 22 years old, we may not have a homeland. We'll just be an idea. The history of our people will have been swallowed by the ocean and will become a myth, a story, and there'll be nowhere for our roots to grow from. We, as Pacific Climate Warriors, are fighting not only to protect our future, but to protect our past. Our ancestors' history, our people's mana, our families' homes are all at risk. And some have already been lost. The Pacific is feeling the effects of climate change faster, more clearly, and more drastically. As a collection of nations that contributes to less than 1% of the global carbon emissions, we are facing the consequences of climate change in full. Climate justice is indigenous liberation. Climate justice is patriarchal liberation. Climate justice is our liberation. And we refuse to be silent as our way of life is being threatened. So to my fellow warriors here, I say to you, you are Matangi Malohi. Strong winds villaging children, brown bodies molding brown minds, moving between healer and warrior, formulating the visions of liberation for years to come. And to the rest of the world, we say, we are not drowning.
Yeah, so those are some of the things I just wanted to share in terms of like the work we've been able to do. It's not just that like I get to go to COP, it's also that like we're involving our students and our community in this work. And it's very important for us that if as those who are most affected by climate change, that we're also making space for our voices to be heard as well, and especially from our young people. So those are just two things that happened. I won't go into the next video around Pacific Power Up, but I'll just say that even with COVID around, it didn't stop polluters, so it didn't stop us from organizing. And we continued to gather and train during COVID and just got really creative with it. I had the opportunity to help facilitate with the global team, but really our 350 Pacific team really stepped up and gave us an amazing way to grow new organizers in that space. Yeah, this is one of my favorite quotes. Peleha Ofa is often, credited for being like the father or the founder of Pacific Islander Studies. But this is a quote, especially if you get an email from me, it's in my email. But the quote is like, we should not be defined by the smallness of our island, but by the greatness of our ocean. We are the sea, we are the ocean, ocean is us. And the reason why I try to do that is I think sometimes we look at like our entry into climate work, and sometimes we got to do all these like big things, and I don't think that's true. Like I did all those things, but where I started was literally here at PCC. And so I talked about that gathering of Pacific Islander students to the Pacific Islander Student Alliance Conference. The very first conference was held at PCC Sylvania. You can't see this picture all the way in the back, but my good buddy here, my brother Stephen Arthur, talking to students. He helped kind of create that space. I was an assistant coordinator at the time at the Sylvania Multicultural Center. And, my entry into this work was just showing this video of the Carteret Islands and that they were sinking. I didn't know much about climate change, but in my Pacific Islander Studies class, I got introduced to this, and I was like, I think people need to know. And this is just encouragement for our students. Like, there's many ways to enter climate work. You don't have to be on TV. You don't have to write a poem. You could just do something very simple as sharing a resource that you had. And so if you look through the chats, Monica's putting in all the links to some of the videos that have been out there or in places you can find them. And just by sharing out some of this work, you're doing your part in this climate movement as well. That's how I started. It led to something bigger down the line. And, is what we're looking for is momentum going forward. So, things are really great, but they do start off in small spaces. And, when you do that, it leads to these things, right? Like I'm able to now gather with young folks and get them to march on the streets. And so where Kevin delivered that speech, we were leading the marches in that space. And, a lot of growing times. We were told in this march that we would be able to lead the march as with a group of indigenous folks, as indigenous people, and as frontline communities. When we got to the front of the line, there were already people there, and everyone was claiming they were frontline communities. And I think it's important to, one, not fight over that terminology, but two, we got to be real with the realities and the effects of climate change and what they mean to people outside of the U.S., like the Pacific Islander community and nations. And if we don't, we're not able to address this stuff, then that reality is going to become true. We're all going to be frontline people, and it's going to be very hard for us to climb out. So yeah, the thing I want to talk about too, like going into the next part is ocean and the climate justice. Like, how is the Pacific Islander nations and people and communities entering COP? And so I titled this "Our Fight, Our Way, Leading the Way," because for all the problems you might see at COP, I feel like indigenous communities have a lot of the solutions and are already practicing these things here at COP. So let's dig into some examples of what that could mean. Here's some observations, things we were able to find out, and then even like my own personal observations in the physical space or around the things that are happening. One of the jaw-dropping numbers I saw is that 70% of the speakers were male identified. No data yet known around like gender diversity yet, but I'm sure those things are going to come out in terms of also where queer and trans folks fall in terms of representation. But yeah, when I saw that number, I was just like, whoa, I can't. Yeah, this makes so much sense. Like, and it doesn't. Well, it makes sense in terms of like, okay, I saw that. It doesn't make sense in terms of like how we operate out of the Pacific, and I'll get into that in the next slide. But accessibility was services. I put were hard to find, or hard to come by. It seemed like a challenge every day to try to find seating. And I think the thing for me where my mind works a lot of times is thinking about my elders, and that I just saw too many elders standing around or just not moving at all out of fear of losing their seats. And so, that's like a logistical thing that needs to be taken care of. Not really something related to COP, but I think it's reflective in terms of how the world views our communities. And as a Pacific Islander, elders are revered a lot of the time. So that didn't sit well with me. Climate polluters were on full display. At least 500 fossil fuel industry lobbyists were there and representing over 100 companies. What we were told is that we were outnumbered by the fossil fuel industries 13-1. And when you're trying to get into a space where you're trying to combat a lot of this stuff, you're trying to combat the use of fossil fuels and coals, like it's tough when they outnumber us. It's tough when they're probably in this threshold here of like the amount of speakers that get to speak, or they're in the ears of leaders. We know a lot of countries or people we were depending on to show up didn't show up. And that's tough, right? Like you heard in the Have Your Say campaign, then that was like, 4 years ago, we were saying, kick climate polluters out of climate talks. And it's still prevalent today. So I think that's going to be a message we're going to continue to push out there, that we know that they're here combating for their right to make their money, but at the expense of our people. And the other part I would say is not a lot of interactions allowed with leadership outside of like these first world countries. Like every leader I saw, whether it was a U.S. delegate, I understand presidents sometimes, but like they're just other world leaders that just were not accessible. And even if you did try to go up to them, they're surrounded by security and staff, or they're just walking around everywhere, and then they're not making time to commit with community. So those are just some of those brief observations I had. And then here are the realities of the Pacific. So team reps embrace diversity. Harmony is such an important thing in the Pacific. And while we still have some work to do, there was noticeably way more women, young people, and queer representation out of the Pacific. I mean, our team majority were women. Same thing with the Marshall Islands, and a lot of the other spaces too. Like even the organizations that were supporting us, a lot of women were taking the lead. And so, I'll dip into this after I read all this stuff. Lively interactions with art and music. We're able to bring that stuff into space, and while it's like very attractive, it brings people in. It's also just the way we function, right? Like how we gather around food, music, stories. Like that should not be hindered in spaces like COP. Like the ability to do that and be successful and to create community using our own protocols and practices, I think is very vital. Not just for the Pacific, for other nations too, or trying to embrace. And we saw that a lot with our indigenous kinfolks who were out there holding the line. Despite the lack of commitment from larger industrial countries, the Pacific held the line for ambitious climate goals. And so we talked about being outnumbered 13-1. We talked about the 500, lobbyists from the fossil fuel industries or the polluting companies. And yet we were able to hold on to these ambitious goals that we had, right? Like there wasn't a turn back on 1.5, although, we're still trying to fight folks that hold their commitment to that. The amount of money that was supposed to come out of the Paris Accords in 2014 hadn't really been distributed the way it needed to be. And the Pacific countries are holding folks accountable. And we're going to try to make sure that that money gets out. And still pushing ambitious goals, right? And so what does it look like in terms of funding loss and damage, adaptation plans? What is the mitigation plans for these accords, and how are they going to make their way in? So that, and I'll just say interactions with leadership. A cool thing is, my mom has this like really it's almost like spider sense, but for Islander people. Like she'll walk into like a Walmart and be like, oh, that person, there's an Islander over there. And our leaders the same way. Like they would see me and come up and shake my hand. They just recognize that our people are here and we need to be in this work collectively. And I thought that was really cool that representatives and negotiators, ministers and prime ministers weren't afraid to come up to us and acknowledge us that we were there. Unlike what we saw with a lot of the other countries where you probably had to be giving a speech in order to be seen or recognized from some of these larger industrial countries. And this is what it means for us, right? Like I'll play a video clip. Some of the things have been already mentioned in some of the other the video clips that we share, but we don't put in we're not admitting carbon emissions, right? Like you can look at here at Kiribati, which is one of our low atoll frontline communities, contribute this number here in terms of carbon or greenhouse gases, and they're like double digits. We look at Kenya and Bangladesh, and they're in double digits, but by the thousands. And we can look at the US and see where they're at in terms of being in the millions in terms of carbon emissions. So a lot of this for us is like, we continue to have these intentional practices of how we enter space. And we're dealing with the fact that like we don't participate in this at all, right? We're like 0.0000 something. It's like cryptocurrency. There's a lot of zeros there. This is not something we can contribute to. And these numbers are, astounding. You look at them, just like, oh my gosh, it's not even close. We have countries who run off 100% renewable energy. The island that my grandparents are from, they have renewable energy that's powering houses, right? So they're almost nearly 100% renewable energy. If the Pacific can do this, even knowing that they're at the front lines of the effects of climate change, and still show up and still lead the way, I think we have a lot to learn from the Pacific. And again, one of our leaders, you saw him in one of the opening clips. He was on the BBC, a BBC debate panel, and someone was asking him around, what do the impacts mean in the Pacific, and are you optimistic about COP26? And here's his response.
I don't understand why it's the people who have contributed the least to the climate crisis that have to pay the most for it in terms of our realities, in terms of us needing to continue to adapt to this, when it's the countries who have contributed the most, who have profited the most from this climate chaos that don't see those impacts. And do I have optimism when it comes to COP26? I think optimism for us is not a choice. We're here because we have to be a part of these negotiations. We have to come to this table in order to make the decisions, in order for this world to make the decisions to ensure the survival of our people and the survival of our islands. And so optimism is not a choice for us. We are here because we need to make this work.
So when we show up into these spaces, right, and like I said, I'm from American Samoa, Joseph's from Tonga. Our other colleagues are also representing Samoa and Tuvalu. We know that, I lived in the Marshall Islands and they were there as well. This is the reality for the islands, right? This is a building being hit during the king tides. And this is the aftermath. This is inundated flooding from the ocean hitting the central parts of the island. And these islands aren't big, right? I think sometimes we get caught up in the exotification of islands and we see big mountainous islands, but the majority of the islands in the Pacific are atolls. In some places on these atolls, I can throw a football from one end of the lagoon side to the ocean side, right? So they're not very wide, and they're also not very tall, standing only a meter or two above sea level, and not keeping global temperatures below 1.5 means that the ocean rises above that threshold. And these are just some of the things that are happening, especially during king tides. Here's some graphics that were presented a couple years back in terms of where the Marshall Islands, or at least its main island, could see itself without an adaptation plan. So this is, I believe, 20 years from now, 30 and 40. So what does adaptation mean? Why is it important? And what are some of the effects? And we'll dip into that a little bit. Adaptation and loss and damage. On the island I was living on, and this is a lot of the islands, the atoll islands, there's like a chain of islands in the atoll. And one of the islands in the chains has already disappeared. And so there's a man standing right here on what used to be an island. And he was telling us it only took like a year or two for everything to disappear. You can't really tell, but there's these little stumps here. And these are, those are the roots of the coconut tree. And the thing that amazes me about the coconut tree, like I've gone through tropical storms, everything falls down except for the coconut tree. So we're talking about what kind of impact does the sea have on our islands? This is one. Those trees aren't standing anymore. And so we're talking about, what's happening here. In some places, it's already happened. And so what they're looking to do is to create these adaptation plans. And it's basically meaning that they're going to build on top of the island so that it has a more of a threshold to deal with the rising sea levels. This is an example of a man-made island. That some engineers and folks in the movement are trying to convince folks to participate in. Well, here's the thing. So talking with the minister, or talking to one of the climate envoys in the Marshall Islands, he was just reminding me that the reason they need a lot of the money to deal with the adaptation plan is because these atolls, like that picture I shown with the man standing on the island, there's multiple islands, right, within the atoll, and some of these places people live. If you're not funding the adaptation plan at the cost that these countries are asking for, right, you're basically asking them that they're going to have to choose between which one of these islands are going to stay and which ones don't. Okay. So people are going to have to be displaced, move from their ancestral lands, because they don't have the money to create the adaptation plan for every island. The Marshall Islands has 36 atoll groups. And out of those 36, they can't fund every one of these islands. And it's not even that they need to be funded for the right for people to survive, but it's also where they're going to get. I'll give you an example. When I was on one of the outer islands, we would travel to another island to go pick up food. Like there'd be crabs on the island. Some of the fish taste better on the other islands, right? But if you don't have those islands, then you don't have access to your basic needs like food. Thanks for the question. Won't the waves be that much higher with or without the full protection of the atolls? That's a good question. I don't have an answer for that. You can keep building up and up. I think to your point, Stefania, but I think we both know the answer to that. It's not a solution. It's just a way to preserve right now until a better solution can come about. So again, there's all those things I talked about. I thought I'd just show some pictures in terms of representation. This is a picture here. We were actually invited backstage into the VIP room where we got to hear former President Barack Obama speak to the High Ambitions Committee. And this is our team with the minister from the Marshall Islands and also some of the reps from Niue. And they were really coming up to us. They're just like I said, they were embracing us. This is also another picture with us with the former Prime Minister of Cook Islands, now the Secretary General of the Pacific Islander Forum, Henry Puna. And I'll play this real quick video in terms of like how we're getting into this work. I know some of this stuff can be really depressing. I'm just trying to bring the realities, but there's another reality too, and it's our positive outlook and island perspectives, while being here at COP. So let me show this video.
Pacific youth have rallied behind the cry, "We are not drowning, we are fighting." This is our warrior cry to the world. We are not drowning, we are fighting.
I think optimism for us is not a choice. We're here because we have to be a part of these negotiations. We have to come to this table in order to make the decisions, in order for this world to make the decisions to ensure the survival of our people and the survival of our islands. Yeah. What have you got there, Lomu?
So we have a QR code to make it more accessible for anybody walking by.
And we put together a document, Youth for Pacific Declaration on Climate, and the symbol of our declaration is the same, or the flower. And so we brought some flowers here for you all today, just to show that appreciation for our elders in the space and those who paved the way before us. And the girls would like to present a few of them to our front row.
All right, I'll get into the next part. There was a question, and I do want to address it. So thanks, Jay, for the question. Would the island still feel like home after engineering, constructing, and adaptation plan is complete? No. And people don't want to leave their island, right? Like their sovereignty is not up for debate. And so leaving is not an option for folks. And they're willing, some countries are willing to build on top. Here's some of the issues around building on top of the island for the adaptation plan. Two things. One, it doesn't all involve building on top of land. It could be around like seawalls and stuff. So I don't want to like be all doomsday in terms of what's happening. There are some new technology that's out there that we were told of. I don't understand. I won't dig into that. But to that point, when you're building over things, you're also building over history. You're also building and covering lands where your forefathers are at, your ancestors. And so graves, like for me, my grandparents are buried right next to my house. Their grave and where they're laid is actually my bed. And I would hate to have to cover that up, right? Like that's not something we want to do. And our stories come from these lands. And so those are all things we want to protect because they're a big part of our identity. So here's the next part I want to get into. I know like this, the news can be gloomy, but it's not all what it comes down to be, right? Like we know some language in the accords weren't as strong as we wanted them to be, but we also know that there was an impact still, and especially from the Pacific in terms of what's happening. And I think also we're trying to pull away from that, like COP26 is the only place where solutions could happen, which is not true, right? Like we still have a lot of local organizing we can do, both in our county and state, and on a national level, where we can hold ourselves accountable. And COP meets every year. So this isn't a sprint to try to complete in a week or 2 weeks, but it is a marathon where we have to keep running, and there is a time limit. But the time limit isn't 2 weeks. So I do want to share these next pieces from some of our experts in negotiations, which is not me, and also what it meant to deliver that the Youth for Pacific Declaration. So here's a video. My face is on here, but we're not going to do the thing because I'm already talking to you about the same things I talked about with these two ladies. But we are going to introduce my friend, COC Carter, or George Carter, and he'll give a better explanation of maybe some of the impacts that the Pacific has had on COP, but also where we're going in terms of the negotiations in the future.
To describe what the Glasgow Accord means now, and how does this affect the Paris Agreement?
Sure. Thank you. So what we have now with the Glasgow Accord that has come out is the vision that the UK presidency has asked countries to put forth for the next 10 years to 2030. What's new? Paris is a change from Kyoto. So Kyoto was a compliance mechanism where it sets the rules and it sets the world of Annex 1 and non-Annex 1. Annex 1 countries have to cut emissions. However, what we have with the Paris Agreement is a voluntary multilateral system where every country has to contribute through their NDCs or through pledges that are given. And so this is the start of a new era in terms of the climate regime, that every country has to contribute. And the onus is on us, or all of us, to put each other's on checks and balances, which means you have to own up to your pledges. You have to own up to the net zero targets that you have facilitated. And so even more from now on, COP will become a very central part of international politics. You need to be there to put pressure throughout the whole year, but especially on those last 2 weeks, to ensure that you need to keep governments and private companies and every other polluter online, as the message, that you need to put them into place. So leading up to next year, some key areas that will move forward, that need to move forward, is in the area of loss and damage, a facility to address this. A second component that will be needed is these pledges on finance, that all these millions of dollars that countries have pledged, we need to, Pacific countries, all countries, even Pacific climate warriors has to keep these countries. You said you're going to do this, you have to do this. No more backsliding. You had to ratchet up in terms of your promises. In terms of the area of ocean, it wasn't really identified, as a key win, but it's still in there. That ocean needs to be a part of the conversation, and though that will be very important for countries. But a big win that we must say that has come through and without the work of Pacific negotiators is in the area of environmental integrity. Part of the finalizing of the rule book was to keep the area of market mechanisms. Now, we do still have very weak rules, but without the Pacific holding the line, as the message that Joseph and Brianna told us, without them holding the line in terms of having strong rules, we would have in a system that bigger emitters would have been able to participate in a market system that we will not see a gradual decrease in greenhouse gas emissions. And so that's some of the fundamental, basic what came out of Glasgow, but more importantly is the pressure moving forward. And the other big win, and I think this is a testament of what the world learned from Pacific Warriors. You have been pushing the message of no to fossil fuels and no to coal for years. This is the first time we have language on a global agreement. But the climate warriors saw that, decades ago up to now. And we also need to acknowledge this is a win that Pacific 350 have been pushing for the last 6 years. And now we have countries speaking about it. Now we have countries wanting to, put it, although it's still weak language, but as they say in climate change or multilateral negotiations, we do it again tomorrow. It's not the end. We keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And that is a testament I'd like to sort of share in this early part of Pacific 350, that language on coal. It wasn't because of UK. It was, I think, because of Pacific 350, and that's your greatest contribution to Glasgow Accord.
Wow. Hi, George. It's so great to hear your insights and, just echoing what Alisi said. It's amazing for us, especially those who could not actually.
So I think, I've had the opportunity to meet with Siosi. Siosi's someone for George. To meet with Siosi, and, he was always filling me in when we finally got to meet. We had dinner one night as a collective group, and the ocean part was really revealing to me that ocean wasn't in language at all. Ocean wasn't in language at all. Like, I think it's only mentioned twice, but not in terms of offering any solutions. And so for someone who's not a negotiator, and for folks who don't know, like, the role of negotiators, pretty much the people who look over the governing documents and make amendments or changes or uphold that, right? And a lot of them are lawyers. They got graduate degrees in environmental policy, or they're scientists, right? And it's rare that someone, where I'm standing gets to get in and hear a lot of what's happening in negotiations. And that's because I had a delegate badge. There's different rankings in terms of access to stuff. There's an observer, and then there's a delegate, and I think there's a VIP one. But the delegate allows you to get into negotiation or backstage, or we got to meet Obama or see Obama, and places where I get to meet some of the negotiators like COC. So that was very helpful. This video here is sort of like that declaration for the Pacific. I'll play this video, and then we'll be able to end with some pictures and stuff going forward. I think I'm forgetting where where everything's at, but check out the video. This is the declaration that we took to Pacific leaders.
During the global climate strikes in September this year, the Pacific came together in a different way. More than 600 young, strong, and proud Pacific Islander voices formed the Youth for Pacific Declaration on Climate Change. We, the youth from the Pacific, and the Pacific youth in the diaspora, representing frontline communities, grassroots organizations, youth networks, and indigenous peoples. We call on our global leaders to respond to the challenge of this time. Respond to the climate crisis through an intersectional lens that prioritizes justice. that promotes inclusive and just world for ourselves and the future generations to come. At this year's COP26 climate negotiations in Glasgow, we will deliver the voice of Pacific youth to our leaders. Now is your chance to join us. Now is your chance to have your say on why you are fighting for your future. Sign the Youth for Pacific Declaration on Climate Change and have your say.
Hey, Mac, you're muted.
Thank you. Thank you. It's gotta happen once a day. Once a day. I just talked to myself for 30 minutes or 30 seconds online. That's not embarrassing at all. All right. So for those who could read lips, you might understand what I was talking about. The say, delivering the Have Your Say declaration happened at the Pacific Islander Forum gathering. These are some of our warriors delivering the flower or the say to world leaders. And so this is the Prime Minister of Fiji, someone who sits in the Secretariat of the PIF. And then in the back, you have Henry Puna, who's the Secretary General of the Pacific Islander Forum, also receiving a lei as well. But outside of this stuff, I think I want to go back to is what's it called? Yeah, thanks everyone. This is embarrassing. We don't have to post that stuff anymore. It's known. It was muted. Thank you. George's talk around ocean was also around ways to fund the loss and damage. So one of the things I was learning was that one of the reasons why some countries didn't want to include the ocean language in the accords was because the use of ocean, and we know that these Pacific nations own or have rights to the maritime spaces around the country, that the use of those are one of the ways that things like fossil fuel and coal are being transported. And so the idea was that to add a tariff or a tax on those who are transporting fossil fuels or coal around the world through our oceans, and that the tax would be one, a deterrent, but two, would be the way that they would fund the loss and damage needs of these Pacific nations. So that's something else I wanted to add. But also, again, the representation of our youth and the access to leaders that's being displayed right here. Here's the fun stuff, my personal experience. So that's all the COP talk we're going to do right now. And then I'm going to go into like the things I've been able to do. And we're going to open this up for Q&A. So this shouldn't take too long, but I do want to shout out the team that I was a part of. One of the reasons I was tapped to go this year, and I've been asked to go to COP, in the past. I just can't take 3 weeks off. So one, I want to just shout out PCC for supporting, this trip and allow me to go without having to use up all my vacation time. It was great to represent the college, and it was nice to not have that pressure of like needing to go back and be in the office and do work. So just want to shout out President Mitsui and my two deans, Heather Lang and Lauren Smith, for all their support to get there. And also this team that's up here. What an amazing group. Such a blessing. Like, I love all these people dearly, and I can't praise them enough. Like, COP is overwhelming. And one of the things I shared was like I was having some trouble finding my place because the first week I was there, I didn't have any I didn't have any speaking gigs or anything until the second week. And so I was trying to find my place. And Brianna Furin, who's pictured a couple places here with the really long hair. They all have really long hair. But this young lady with the red dress, she was one of the opening speakers at the conference. And she delivered a masterful speech. I mean, I always tell BB, like, she should be my speech writer. She is amazing at this. But she told me, like, Mac, like 2 COPs ago, I was only here for like a day or two. And the COP before that, I was just making coffee for everybody. And when she told me that, like in terms of like the progression folks can take, I was just like, yeah, you know what? That's right. Like, I need to find my place right here. And a lot of that ended up being running around, doing chores or carrying bags or trying to be like a positive support for everyone who was participating. So that was a great message. Moi Moana is an amazing dancer. Before my time, with all this work, dancing was a big part of my life. But living in the U.S. as a Pacific Islander is tough because that's the only expectation a lot of times for our people is to sing, dance, play football, and be in pro wrestling. And I just felt like I'm more than that. And I kind of lost that passion for dance. And meeting Moi Moana kind of brought that back. And then my little sister, I call her because she calls me uncle, Salome, just being able to have so many things in common, especially around our religious beliefs, and just to enter that work and our experiences and survival of church. Sometimes I would put it that way. And just being like everyday people, like that's the amazing thing with a lot of us. We're not coming in with a ton of money. We're not from wealthy families. We're not, at least not yet, some of us, prominent figures, but humility is one of the things like any one of these folks could be at the top of the game. And last but not least, our leader, Joseph Sekulu, who was featured in a bunch of videos. Just a compassionate leader, and always putting our health and our mental health first and our team first. And I really appreciate that. That's something I can take back to our team if I'm not doing enough of it already. That taking care of ourselves sometimes is better than the actual task at hand. And putting people first, I think, is a practice a lot of world leaders could use, especially in this climate world. I had a lot of access to places. This is me fake pretending to talk at a negotiation table. I got to present and represent PCC, talk a lot about like our climate action plan, talk about the impacts of climate work and the importance of it for BIPOC communities, and then just being invited to spaces. This was a great opportunity really to speak and protest peacefully. I got to speak in front of the Lloyds of London, who are ensuring big climate projects, climate pollution projects like the Adani mines that really just have a big effect on the Pacific.
I don't know how many of you listen to American hip hop.
Okay, so that's about as much as I could record. That's how close I was to Obama. But when you start talking about like American hip hop and stuff, I felt like it was my dad out there talking. I can only imagine what his daughters are feeling when their dad's trying to say all this cool stuff and he's not there. But being live on TV was cool. On Sky News, probably the worst interview I ever gave. I kept calling the High Ambition Coalition the High Action Committee. I don't know why, but everything else I said I think was really good on there because they invited me back to speak on there, so that was pretty cool. And then getting out to travel. This is Edinburgh Castle. Getting out of Glasgow and just seeing the world was kind of cool. And just meeting a lot of cool people, right? So we got the marching, this protest. I was able to hold the American Samoa flag. That was really cool to get out there. Also, being the only person from American Samoa that was out there, that was important. Meeting other indigenous folks, rekindling my love for music. I love music, but I'm not like a great fan of what do you call it, performing, and I think that kind of brought a love back. Random people meeting us and giving us awards. You know, they're like, "Hey, are you the Pacific Climate Warriors? This is like, we want to give you these badges. We recognize your work," and they mentioned all their work, and it felt really good to be recognized, and also to see Governor Brown there. And you know, it's interesting. We talk about like not being recognized by world leaders or by like our community leaders, but like Governor Brown remembered who I was, and I was just like, I'm pretty sure that's Governor Brown. I got to go say what's up. So I went and said hi, and that was pretty fun. And last but not least is the food. I was told that the food there wasn't that good. I'm going to disagree. I thought the food was amazing. So one of my favorite foods is lamb shanks, and or lamb in general. There was a ton of lamb in Scotland. I'm definitely happy about that. One of my favorite foods is hot and sour soup. So if I went to like a Chinese restaurant, I just had to see if it was still the same. Still pretty good, universal. And then I went to Taco Bell. I know. I just had to know. I had to know. I went to 2 Taco Bells. The first time I went, because I needed to know if it's still the same. It's not the same. And Higgins is good. Everything but Higgins. I love Higgins. Yep, that Higgins stuff is Haggins. Is really good. I loved all the other food. Taco Bell. At one Taco Bell, I went to. I was like, "You guys have any hot sauce?" And they were like, "What's hot sauce?" I was like, "No. Oh no." It was the worst. And then I went to another one in town, and they had hot sauce there, and it was weird, kind of conflicting for some of us because, you know, COP is 24 hours, right? And so sometimes you're not getting out of COP till midnight, and some people are staying back to report back to their countries in a different time zone. So it's a lot of work, and when you're out, you're hungry. And in the part of the city we were in, late at night, Taco Bell was the only thing open, and so I know, poor me. You go to Taco Bell and eat all that food. And that's really it. I think it's a good time to take question and answers. I know, Monica, you're probably gonna.
Yeah, so here's some questions that we have. One from Andrea. I attend PCC online. How can I connect, participate, interact with the Multicultural Center?
Cool. I think one of the first things you can do is join our online community on Discord. Maybe we can get Monica to post the.
Yeah, I'll throw that in the chat.
That's one way. You know, it's been tough online because the way we build community has always been in person. It's been around food. It's been around, you know, music. I always have my guitar in my space. I think I'm going to bring my piano when we get back. I think that would be cool. But I think Discord is one of the ways we're doing that. And then in programs. So continuing to look out for any of the programs that are online. I know that Rock Creek had a couple of programs for college visits. Yesterday was Prairie View, a historically Black college university tour that happened. And then Cascade is also doing something, I think this week or next week, that centers around women of color. So you can go on the website. You can look up the contact information for any of the coordinators or assistant coordinators in the Multicultural Center tabs. And ask questions if you have anything about those programs that are happening. But yeah, feel free to connect with us on Discord. We use it a lot.
Another question we have from BB is, if you didn't go for 3 weeks as proposed in the past, how long were you there this time?
If I didn't go for 3 weeks as proposed in the past, how long? I was there for 3 weeks this time. COP does run, the actual COP conference runs for 2 weeks. We did pre-COP stuff this time around. In the past, what I would do is, because we know we're doing all these things leading up to COP, like, so that video with Chaminade University and City College of San Francisco, and Portland State University. That took like a month of planning. So we're constantly doing things to interact and participate with the global team. And one of the other things we've been doing lately, like the last 2 years, this year specifically, is that we've had like 5 days straight, we've had different campaigns that have happened. And so people are able to participate in different ways, either making a TikTok video, making a banner, drawing a picture of a say. And you can find all that stuff and how we participated if you go to the 350 Pacific or the Pacific Climate Warrior social media pages. But my whole thing about not going before and try to do it this time is to make sure that we have access to COP, right? Like we understand what's happening at COP. I think one of the weird, interesting experiences I had is like knowing that I'm coming from the U.S. and I'm sort of like in the place that emits the most, you know, in terms of carbon and greenhouse emissions. So I have to be really careful about my positionality and some of the things I say and making sure I'm living true to that.
Yeah, BB also wanted to add, what were the biggest changes to come out of COP? As well as, or was this type of summit where voting and things happen in the moment?
I think George, I'll talk about two things. One, that stuff that George talked about in the negotiations. Sometimes you can't get everything, but having language included that wasn't there before, once it's in there, then we know it's there. Like the phasing out, or like I'm forgetting the language that they use, but it wasn't very strong language. It was just like phase away. We're gonna move away instead of like phasing out. Like this thing needs to get coal and gas need to like not be. We need to always like get rid of it. You know, that's what I think we wanted, but the fact that it was included is a change and will lead to, I think, greater solutions down the line. In terms of visibility, you know, a lot of the work we're trying to do is to get out and share our work with the community, our perspectives with everybody. And we were able to do that with a great team. 350.org helped us out a lot in terms of our visibility, because we were able to get 6.2 billion people. That was our reach over those 3 weeks that we were there in the UK. And that's huge, right? To reach 6.2 billion people who are going to either view, see, or take time to check out what we're doing. And add a different spin. One of the things I want to mention is, you know, there's a lot of movement that happened outside from like non-BIPOC spaces. I mean, I'll just say it like that. And it was kind of troubling to us. Like, I get what they're saying when they're like, there's no leadership inside, right? Like leadership's not happening out there inside COP, is happening out here. And one of the things was like, blah, blah, blah was another saying that went around. Like, it's just like talk. And for us, especially from the Pacific and a lot of indigenous communities, we felt like that was very dismissive of the work that we were doing. Like, we're not big oil companies. We're not big emitters. We're low atoll islands. We're everyday people, and we're people of color, people of culture. And we brought it, right? So if we're not there holding the line, you know, these things don't happen. And when you say there's no leadership inside and we know we're doing that work, that's not including everybody in this movement. It's divisive and it's dismissive. And I think whoever came up with those things, they need to go back, because I don't think they meant us. I'm not saying they're saying like all the Pacific, you know, are part of the problem. But I don't think they were seeing us in for our contributions. And I think that's something that was problematic.
For sure. Mosin, I think I'm pronouncing that right. If I'm pronouncing it wrong, I'm very sorry. How can everyday people try to make a reasonable difference in their daily lives to provide support for climate change?
Yeah, this is tough, because I don't think it's just on any one person to take on a lot of this work. And so things like our Multicultural Center, creating these job positions and these programs, I think there should be vessels for students to hop on with great navigation to take us to where we need to go in terms of this work. And that's one day everyday students, I think, can be able to participate. And there's organizations out there. So one of the things I say is like not using plastic straws will help, but getting involved with how they got that organizing to ban plastic straws is better. So if you can get into an organization, and I mean, literally just Google climate.org Portland and things are going to pop up. And you can check out the resources at PCC. So the Environmental Center and the Sustainability Office are doing great work. And I think if we can, like I said, we can create the vessels for students to partake, or we can create the vessels like organizations outside of PCC for people to partake. They can go on that navigational journey to help save this planet.
Stacy asks, no.
No,
no,
just kidding. I'm kidding,
no. Stacy doesn't ask. No. Yeah. Any reflections on how the Biden administration showed up and engaged at COP this year?
Sometimes this is how I feel, right? Like the U.S. shows up with a lot of promises and resources when we have the administration in. So one of the things that's interesting is like, I don't think people understand is like this administration has to clean up the work from the previous administration.
Right.
And so there are still contracts and things that they're obligated to fulfill that make them look bad because like, they're like, yeah, we're going to take all this gas out of this place and these places that aren't necessarily in the realm. What I wish they would do is just be a little more, aggressive, because the previous administration was, and they made things happen. And I know it might not make everyone happy, but they made things happen whenever they wanted to. And I think that's the kind of assertiveness, or I don't know if it's assertive or aggressiveness, that I wish the Biden administration would take. But they also showed up. And they were in the Pacific spaces. And so they rejoined the HAC, the High Ambition Coalition. They brought in their heavy guns. So Obama and John Kerry were back. And they can still do a little bit more, right? So
right.
We'll see what COP27 brings. But a reintroduction isn't going to include everything because there's too much of a mess to clean up.
4 times hot asks, what small actions can we do that if everyone did would make a difference? Changing the way we eat comes to mind.
Changing the way we eat. And here's the thing is, it's not that like you're eating meat that's going to be a problem. It's the overconsumption, right? And it's the transportation. So I think we could all eat meat if we were all growing our own crops, right? And we were just taking what we need. I think also balancing out the amount of food and the kinds of food we have would also solve that problem. And I think I try to stay away from like, what if we all just stop driving our cars, right? Like those aren't going to help with what we call a just transition. Like we can all start doing that now, but there needs to be a pathway to moving away from, the use of gasoline. Like for me, when we went and bought a car, I want to say this too. When I started removing more meats from my diet and started exploring with more veggies, I was surprised like how much better my food is. And so I think also there's a lot of campaigning to be like, ew, vegetarian food, ooh, vegan food. Like it's not that great. You can find and flavor things up any way you want. My mom makes magic out of like terrible food, and so do I. And then, it's just, I think what kind of work you put into it. But yeah, going back to the small actions, I had to buy a hybrid car because I can't afford to put in the refueling station or the recharge station in my house, right? So we know that like people will make the steps they need to make to finally get there, but we also have to be responsible for those who don't have the resources to make that kind of change. So if you can move to eating more healthy and sustainable foods, like shopping at the farmer's market, which could be spendy, I think you should do that. And we can also participate in community gardens so that food is available to folks who can't afford that. And I think that's where you can put some of your organizing magic into play, as Andrew would say.
Definitely. One thing I definitely miss from being remote is the community garden at Sylvania.
And the food's good.
Yeah. The food's good. Let's see. I don't have any other questions from the audience, but we had a few on, did you have any personal takeaways?
Yeah. It was almost like an aha, like I had an epiphany. And I had this before in other work too. So shout out to Dr. Clifford Meeks, who runs our Men of Color program. When I came back to PCC, I was asked to run the Men of Color leadership program. I had been out of men's work for a good 3 or 4 years. And when I came back, I realized how out of touch I was. And I told everybody that too. And it was good to admit it, because what it means is validating that if you're going to be in this work, you got to put some respect on the game. If you're going to take on climate change, it has to be your life. Like, we have to include it in everything we're doing. And I realized there was a lot I wasn't bringing into my life around how I participate in a lot of the global climate movements and stuff. And I think that's part of the reason I felt a little bit lost at COP. I mean, I'm so blessed that, like, I was with experienced people who were coaching me along the way. I also need to give myself some grace because it was my first COP in person.
Right.
And if I want to participate and make an impact like I want to do, I have to keep up the work with environmental groups, especially on the international level, so that I can be at COP and fully participate and have an impact in the way that I know I can.
Great, thank you. Was there anything that surprised you at COP26?
It's massive. Oh my gosh. Like, I sit on the planning committee, the national planning committee for NCORE, the National Conference on Race and Ethnicity. I know some people go to it and they're like, "This is the biggest conference I ever went to." This is like NCORE times 3. It is go, go, go all the time. And, it was overwhelming sometimes. It's just like how much is happening and trying to keep up. It's really, I'm glad go ahead.
I was going to say, I mean, you took over a small town. I have friends in that town who were like, I'm not leaving my house for this week because it's more crowded than it's ever been. So,
yeah, it kind of reminded me too of, like, when you have that many people show up. I don't know if anyone's read those stories of, like, what happens when the Olympics or World Cup comes to, like, a city, and they build all these things that, like, the local infrastructure just can't handle.
Yeah.
And so there were strikes and protests, local opposition against COP happening because it was taking up so much space.
Yeah.
The garbage workers were actually on strike, and for like the first week there was no trash being taken out, so they ended that. And we also didn't want to cross lines. Like, we were lucky that the rail system rail workers went back to work, because we were trying to figure out how we're going to get from London to Glasgow, and we're looking at driving. But then I think the strike ended and we were able to take the train like we wanted.
Well, we've only got a few minutes left, and did you want to tell us maybe like a couple points that you learned while you were there, or just any type of like takeaway you'd like to leave with the rest of us?
Yeah, I'll just say this. All the environmental justice work can't live in the sustainability office and the environmental center alone, or like a lot of ASPCC things that are happening. It's got to be everywhere.
Right.
And one thing I learned is, like, it's not a sprint, but it is a heavy lift. And those centers can't do it on their own. Those offices can't do it on their own, which is why we brought this work into the MC at Sylvania. And it's really, literally, it's going to take the district MC to do this. It's going to take the queer and trans spaces. It's going to take the Women's Resource Center. It's going to take international office. It's going to take, so many different aspects of our work, and not just at PCC, but everywhere, so that we're taking this work into our daily lives and that we understand the magnitude of what's happening, especially to protect the Pacific. So this is something I hope that grows out more and more, and that we can grow some of these spaces. And there's a reality, right? I always say this in terms of our work. You saw the impending waves in the Pacific. They're literal waves.
Yeah.
Here in the US, for our communities, these aren't the impending waves, right? So we have to address those impending waves. We have to address racism. We have to address, the harm happening to queer and trans folks, to our indigenous community, to women, so that once our students, our community feel like those things are being addressed, they can then make space to include the climate movement in a lot of their work. But if you don't do that, we don't unpack some of that stuff, it's going to be very hard, because the climate effects aren't very prevalent to us here. Like, we don't see them as great as you might back in the Pacific or in places in the global South. So I think we have to just do a little bit more to untie these binds that are holding down our community and our students, especially our BIPOC folks, so they can participate fully in the climate, or participate more in these climate movements.
Well, it is 2:00. So thank you everybody for coming. If you have any additional questions, feel free to contact us on our many platforms, either our Twitter, you can see the link below on our little banner down there, where to find us on Twitter, on Instagram, and then also there is a link in our in the chat for the Discord. Also you can email us at culture@pcc.edu. All right. Thanks so much for coming.
All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.
Take care.